And when did the government start understanding they needed this information then with the census? When did that come about? Do you remember?
I don't know how to answer that. I'm not entirely certain even if today they have. If you look at the response to getting data in from schools about children that are being educated, children of key workers, the solution they've got together there hasn't really helped schools. It's an add-on which requires schools to do more work than is strictly necessary. It took a long time to convince the department, whatever it was called at that time, to go electronic. I've exaggerated in terms of them not understanding the importance of it, but I don't really know how to express it. I don't think their first thought is how can we do this without imposing things on schools. What's there already? What can we ask suppliers to do? They do have a difficulty in that it's a commercial market, and so they can only ask suppliers to do things under the way they construct themselves at the moment. I think they could be more prescriptive. So I think they could actually put a kite mark on something and demand that it does certain things. That's the way, if I was in the civil service, that's the way I would go. So I wouldn't allow a school to buy an unkite mark solution. And that kite mark, if the government needs information on children that are key workers' children, then you need to respond to this and quickly. But it's not the philosophy that works at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting because I remember many times when going to the DfE and ultimately the pushback from suppliers was always, you pay us to do this and we'll do it. And actually that's, governments are never going to do that.
And they touch on the other problem that I think suppliers have got is that their user bases are not big enough to allow the type of investment that is needed in today's world. So, a user base of say 2% is very small indeed. And I suspect that you're probably running up debt with that type of user base rather than actually making enough money to invest properly. So you're probably having to persuade investors that you're onto a winner, and that must be quite time consuming.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I suppose it's not. You're right in some ways with MIS. It's not. You can't really do an entry MIS without thinking about census, which is quite costly in its own right. So actually, coming into the MIS market is always going to be now more costly than it's probably ever been.
It is costly, but probably when I was at Capita, the costs were much higher than it would be if we were a startup, and also if you're cloud based. So when I was there, and I think still, SIMS is largely in school, and you cannot afford to have a mistake because you've got to redistribute, and redistribution is painful. So your testing regime has to be incredibly thorough, and that means you have to have quite large teams. You have to be absolutely certain you've got it right, and even if you haven't got it 100% right, you can't be sure which schools are going to get the problem. So you actually end up redistributing for what might only affect 1 in 150 schools.
Yeah.
If you're a startup and you're on the cloud, you're probably used to rolling out increments, probably not even mentioning that you've made a mistake and correcting it before people realize it's there.
Yeah.
So your quality controls don't actually have to be quite as high because the implication for you of getting it wrong isn't so great. So I don't think it necessarily is massively expensive for these suppliers that are on the cloud to make relatively minor adjustments to their software to cope with new needs.
Yeah. Okay. I think this. Well, I suppose with Capita, because that's both our backgrounds. I suppose with the Capita thing as well is because of the number of customers. Then we're always a bit more cautious of quality anyway, or we had to be more cautious of quality.
I think when you're in a market lead position, your customers are expecting much more of you to get it right. I mean, why shouldn't they? They're paying you, you've got a big market share, you should damn well get it right. I think if you've taken a risk on a smaller supplier, probably your tolerance is higher because you've probably got a smaller user base that you can respond to almost on a one-to-one basis. So I think the problem of Capita getting it wrong is worse than another smaller supplier.
Yeah, sure. So now we're basically probably onto the day really in some ways. But so where do you see the market going from this perspective? Which MISs do you think are really getting it right? And also, what do you think the impact on Capita not getting their solution out now is going to be? Because obviously it's been quite a few years since both of us have been there, but they're still in that same predicament of, they still got some potential issues, I'm assuming, with their product because, ultimately they still haven't rolled out to a great audience. And I'm not trying to be critical of that. I appreciate they're trying to make sure it's right. But all these other companies, they should be making more hay, surely.
I think that's quite a difficult one to understand. And, 3 years away from it, I'm probably not best positioned to know exactly what is going on. But I've been quite surprised at how resilient the Capita market share has been. So it's dropped from 83% to 75%, which, if I was there, I would be, mortified at that. But,
you definitely would have been.
If you put it into context, in terms of the competition that's out there, which is clearly stronger than it's been for quite some time, if I was sitting at Capita HQ, probably I'd be moderately relaxed. And I think the reason that the market share hasn't dropped quite as much as perhaps I thought it would in the first place, I'm not saying it's not going to drop further, I think it will. But I think the academy movement and Capita's pricing policy for new academies had a lot to do with alternative solutions being played with or experimented with. I remember talking to one multi-academy trust, and it was when I was there. So I'm responsible for putting in a high price tag. But his view was that the offer that came in was, I don't know, a tenth of what we put in.
Yeah.
And he said to me, well, I could employ 3 extra staff and put right any problems there are with the software. So I'm going to take a risk with supplier X. And that does make an awful lot of sense. The fact that, as far as I can see, the government is no longer pushing academies at the same rate probably helped Capita maintain its market. Because when it comes down to it, Sims is, I would suggest, still the deepest of the solutions. And why would you, if you're paying a relatively small amount of money every year for a piece of software that does everything, albeit it doesn't do it as simply as I think it should do, why would you make a change? Why would you take that on? You'd need to be convinced that the alternative was a lot better. Now, a lot of schools, primary schools in particular, don't use the depth that's in Sims. That might be because, frankly, you've got to work too hard to get to the depths. And that was one of the things that the next generation was supposed to solve.
Yeah.
So if you are a multi-academy trust and you think that you're being charged too much for the Sims product, you could go to an alternative product. Scholar Pack is an interesting one. I think it's done very well. I would suggest it's a relatively simple system. That isn't to say, though, it's not effective. And it may be that schools that use Scholar Pack, because it is simpler, get more out of it than they got out of Sims. It's entirely possible.
I agree.
So, although I think it doesn't do as much, and I would like to see schools take advantage of the stuff that's in Sims, if they don't know it's there and they've never used it, they're not missing it. So I think products like Scholar Pack, which I think only really appeal to relatively small schools, are effective in those environments. I don't think at the moment they would survive in a much larger primary school or group of primary schools. Could be wrong, but I wouldn't think they would. I think Arbor looks like a very attractive solution. It's got a nice look to it. When I played with it, it was far too clicky for my liking. You had to do too many clicks to do things. But it's nicely designed. I think the people that run it have got the right attitude towards their customers.
Yep.
They really do treat their customers well, as far as I can see. They've got some excellent Sims people there. So they're bringing a lot of knowledge about what Sims did, and re-engineering it in a way that is making it more accessible. So I think they're doing well. But even Arbor has only got 1,000 schools. And great that they've achieved that. But can they sustain a big operation like that without huge investment from private equity? Now, it may well be that the gamble of breaking the Sims market is sufficiently great for the investors to keep on stumping up the money.
Yep.
There's no way that Capita can carry on with the existing Sims 7 product forever, and they absolutely need to get into the cloud.
Yep.
But at the moment, there's no sign of that happening, and all the people that, frankly, I trusted and got on well with and respected have left Capita in terms of the product management team. So it's hard for me to envisage how they're going to pull off a cloud release.
Yep.
I mean, 8. I think it's quite sad, really, that well, for me personally, 8 had a lot of stuff in it that was a significant paradigm shift.
Yep.
That made things so much simpler and much more powerful at the same time. And what I don't see in the solutions that are out there are paradigm shifts. I see them emulating much of what Sims did, but probably definitely in prettier screens.
Yep. I totally agree with you. I think there's a bit of a Me Too out there, I think, sometimes.
And why wouldn't you use that if you don't know anything else? I mean, the whole point of the Sims 8 operation was to shift the paradigm, to actually make it much more powerful, much more obvious how to do things, much more transparent. And I don't see that in, I would suggest, any of the solutions that are out there. They're doing a better job at what Sims 7 did in some cases, but they're not shifting the paradigm.
But I suppose the trouble for Sims or Capita now is that actually there are more and more products coming into the market, like PhonicWise. They've just taken 20 schools this year, from the maintain sector. And I know they're small numbers, but they're all biting around the edges. There's this whole thing where, the more products that come into the market that just start nibbling away, then that turns into quite a large percentage of Capita Sims' share. And I think that's, and also I suppose it will create an element of innovation. Surely that they all will then have to start competing against themselves as well. But I just don't see it at the moment, as you just said. I think at the moment there's too much of a Me Too. Maybe that's where we've got to, and now the next phase will be more innovation. I don't know. What do you think?
It clearly could be. It clearly could be. I think the difficulty is that if you're hand to mouth, then taking a risk on innovation is quite hard to pull off. And you're not going to get anywhere with 27 schools.
Yeah.
You're just not going to do it. I mean, I know you've got to win them one by one, but if the academy market has slowed down, as I think it has, then the buyers, the new buyers, are not appearing. And so, although I do think Capita will lose market share over time, and it will disappear if they don't wake up, it's much slower on the decline than I expected.